the Universal Fear Commission declared human horror entertainment a psychological wonder. Part 1. Doctor had studied fear for 300 years. As in, she possessed 4 eyes capable of detecting emotional responses through heat signatures, and her species had spent cataloging psychological responses across the galaxy. When the Galactic Council created the Universal Fear Commission, she seemed like the obvious choice to lead it. The Commission's purpose was straightforward. Every species in the galaxy experienced fear differently. The froze completely when frightened, their chitinous bodies locking up for hours. The released a paralytic chemical that knocked out their entire crew when threatened. The simply fainted. Understanding these responses could prevent disasters, improve safety protocols, and help species work together during emergencies. For 2 years, and her team traveled from world to world. They documented, measured, and analyzed. They created detailed reports on how each species processed danger. The work was methodical and predictable. Fear, they confirmed, was universally unpleasant. Every intelligent species tried to avoid it. Then they arrived at Earth. The initial surveys seemed normal enough. Humans experienced standard fear responses, elevated heart rate, adrenaline release, heightened awareness. Their fight-or-flight mechanism was well developed, probably because they had evolved as relatively weak creatures on a planet full of large predators. Nothing unusual so far. But then, junior researcher, a young named, stumbled onto something strange while reviewing human entertainment databases. Doctor said, his translator struggling with his confused clicking sounds. I think there's an error in the data. The humans have an entire entertainment category labeled horror. I assumed it was mistranslation, but the definition is quite clear. They create fictional content designed specifically to frighten themselves. 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of confusion. That cannot be correct. Run the analysis again. The results were the same. Humans produced thousands of books, films, games, and experiences with the sole purpose of triggering fear responses. More strangely, they paid their currency to access this content. They chose to be afraid. We need to interview humans directly, decided. There must be something we're misunderstanding. The commission set up interviews with various humans. The first was a cheerful woman named Sarah who worked at something called a haunted house. Oh yes, Sarah said, smiling broadly. We get thousands of people coming through every October. We have actors dressed as monsters, scary sound effects, dark corridors. People love it. But why? Asked, all 4 eyes focused intently on Sarah's face. Why do they love being frightened? Sarah thought for a moment. It's fun. It's a safe way to feel that rush of adrenaline. You know the monsters aren't real, so you can enjoy the fear without actual danger. This explanation made no sense to any member of the commission. Tried a different approach. Do humans not have enough real dangers to fear? Well, sure, but those are depressing, Sarah said. Horror entertainment is different. You can walk away from it whenever you want. The commission interviewed dozens more humans. A film director who specialized in scary movies. A novelist who wrote stories about ghosts and demons. A game designer who created survival horror experiences. A teenager who collected horror merchandise. They all said variations of the same thing. Fear could be enjoyable when experienced safely. Volunteered to watch a human horror film as part of their research. He chose one that humans had rated as appropriate for teenagers, figuring it would be mild. The film was called The Exorcist. Lasted 14 minutes before his entire body locked up in the fear response. It took 3 hours and a medical team to get him moving again. When he could finally communicate, he simply clicked out a single word. Impossible. What did you see? Asked. Things that should not exist, said, still trembling. A young human child possessed by a malevolent entity, medical procedures shown in graphic detail, the violation of every sacred bond, and humans watch this voluntarily, for entertainment. decided to try herself. She selected what the database listed as a mild horror film, something called Jaws. It was about a large aquatic predator. She made it through the entire film, but only barely. Her thermal sensors overloaded twice. Her secondary hearts began racing, and this was considered mild. Humans showed this to their offspring. The commission called an emergency meeting. The representatives suggested they immediately classify humanity as a Class 3 psychological hazard and limit contact. They are either suffering from species-wide delusion, they said, or they are lying about finding fear enjoyable. No sane species would do this to themselves. But had noticed something. During all their interviews, she had been monitoring the humans' physiological responses. They genuinely seemed to enjoy discussing horror. Their stress markers were low. They showed signs of pleasure when describing their favorite scary stories. More importantly, she had been reviewing Earth's crisis response records. Humans who regularly consumed horror entertainment showed remarkable performance during actual emergencies. They had better decision-making under pressure, faster threat assessment, and stronger emotional regulation during disasters. "I want to run a correlation analysis," announced. "Compare horror entertainment consumption with emergency response capabilities across the human population." The data team worked through the night. When they presented their findings, the room fell silent. The correlation was undeniable. Humans who regularly exposed themselves to fictional fear demonstrated measurably superior performance during real crises. They were less likely to panic, more likely to help others, and significantly better at maintaining rational thought when frightened. "This contradicts every psychological model we have," one researcher said. "Fear should degrade performance, not enhance it." Studied the data for hours. Slowly, a theory began forming in her mind. Humans weren't just exposing themselves to fear randomly. They were training themselves. By experiencing simulated danger in safe environments, they were essentially practicing for real emergencies. She thought about Earth's history. Humans had evolved on a remarkably dangerous planet. Ice ages, megapredators, diseases, natural disasters. They were physically weak compared to most threats they faced. They had no armor, no venom, no natural weapons beyond their minds. Maybe horror entertainment was an evolutionary adaptation, a way to prepare for dangers without having to actually face them. Mental rehearsal for catastrophe. "We need to design a proper experiment," said. "We need to test whether exposure to human horror content can produce similar benefits in other species." "Absolutely not," the representative said immediately. "We've seen what this content does. Still requires therapy. We cannot expose more of our people to this psychological weapon." "It's not a weapon," said calmly. "I think it might be medicine." The argument continued for days. Finally, they agreed on a compromise. They would recruit volunteers from various species and expose them to carefully graduated human horror content, starting with the mildest examples they could find. All participants would have full medical and psychological support. Anyone could withdraw at any time. They put out the call for volunteers. To his surprise, they got hundreds of applications. It seemed many species were curious about this bizarre human trait, even if the curiosity was mixed with fear. The experiment would begin in one standard galactic week. Spent that time preparing, reviewing human psychological literature on exposure therapy, catharsis, and the cultural role of frightening stories throughout human history. The more she read, the more fascinated she became. Humans had been telling scary stories for thousands of years, long before they understood why. They had instinctively known that confronting fear in safe contexts made them stronger. One human researcher had written something that stuck with, "We are not the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most well-armed, but we might be the bravest because we practice being brave." As the experiment start date approached, felt something she rarely experienced. She felt afraid afraid that the experiment would fail, afraid that she was wrong about humans, afraid that she might be right, and that everything the galaxy thought it knew about fear and psychology was incomplete. But she also felt something else. She felt excited. Perhaps, she thought, she was beginning to understand humans after all. Part 2. The first day of the experiment did not go well. Had selected what she believed was the gentlest possible introduction to human horror entertainment, a children's book called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. The illustrations were simple. The stories were short. Human children read these at age 8 or 9. The first volunteer, a diplomat named, made it through 3 pages before his body released the paralytic chemical that knocked out everyone in the room. It took an hour to revive them all, and another 2 hours to convince that he hadn't actually been in danger. The story was about a woman with a ribbon around her neck, said, still shaking. And when the ribbon came off, her head fell off. Why would anyone tell that to a child? Didn't have a good answer. They tried different content with different volunteers. A watched 5 minutes of a mild ghost story before fainting. A attempted to read a short horror story and locked up completely. Even a, whose species prided itself on bravery, refused to continue after encountering a description of a zombie. After 2 weeks, they had made almost no progress. Out of 40 volunteers, 38 had withdrawn. The 2 who remained were struggling badly, requiring daily therapy sessions. The commission called another meeting. The representative looked vindicated. We have proven that human horror content is psychologically damaging to other species, he said. We should recommend that humans restrict this content to their own population. No, said, we're approaching this wrong. She had spent the 2 weeks studying not just human horror, but human psychology more broadly. She had learned about something called exposure therapy, where humans gradually confronted their fears in controlled settings. She had read about how human warriors trained by simulating battle conditions. She had discovered that human children played games where they pretended to be in danger. The pattern was clear. Humans didn't just jump into fear, they built up to it. We need human consultants, announced. We need people who understand how to introduce others to horror content properly. We've been treating this like a scientific experiment, but it's more like learning to swim. You don't throw someone into the deep water first. They brought in a human psychologist named Doctor who specialized in anxiety disorders. They also recruited a film studies professor who taught courses on horror cinema. Both humans were fascinated by the project. You're doing this completely backward, said after reviewing their methods. You can't just show someone scary content and expect them to handle it. You have to build psychological resilience first, understanding why the fear is safe, learning techniques to manage anxiety, creating a sense of control. Nodded. Horror appreciation is learned. Even human children have to develop it gradually. You start with silly monsters and magical stories. Then you move to more realistic fears. Eventually, you can handle truly disturbing content, but only because you've trained your mind to process it. With the humans' guidance, they redesigned the experiment completely. They started with simple exercises, teaching volunteers to recognize that fictional fear was different from real danger, helping them develop what called psychological distance from the content. Then they introduced the mildest possible horror concepts, not scary stories, but stories about characters overcoming fear, stories where the monster was defeated, stories with happy endings. Progress was slow but measurable. After another month, several volunteers could read entire children's horror stories without severe reactions. A few could even watch short films, though they needed frequent breaks. More importantly, his team began testing the volunteers in simulated emergency situations. The results were remarkable. Volunteers who had been exposed to horror content, even at this mild level, showed improved performance compared to their baseline measurements. They were calmer, thought more clearly, and made better decisions. One volunteer, unnamed, had entered the program with crippling anxiety about her job as a space station emergency coordinator. She had been unable to run disaster drills without locking up. After 6 weeks of gradual horror exposure, she successfully managed a simulated station evacuation without any freeze response. I kept thinking about the characters in the stories, explained. They were afraid too, but they kept moving. They kept thinking. If fictional humans could face monsters, I could face a simulation. Word of these successes spread. More volunteers applied to the program. Species from across the galaxy wanted to understand this human trick for turning fear into strength. Also made another discovery. She began analyzing human horror content more deeply, looking beyond just the fear factor. She noticed something the commission had missed initially. Human horror stories weren't just about being scared. They were about confronting death, loss, the unknown, morality, and identity. Humans used fear as a framework to explore the deepest philosophical questions. Their scariest stories often examined what it meant to be human, to be good, to be alive. Other species avoid thinking about death, said during one of her analysis sessions with End. We find it too distressing. How do humans cope with mortality? We don't really, said. But horror lets us look at it indirectly. A zombie apocalypse story isn't really about zombies. It's about the end of civilization, about what we value, about who we become under pressure. The fear makes these questions safe to explore. Added, horror is philosophical protection. We wrap the scary questions in monsters and ghosts so we can examine them without being overwhelmed. This realization changed everything. Understood now that human horror entertainment wasn't just about training fear responses. It was about building psychological and philosophical resilience. It was about learning to think about terrible things without breaking. The commission expanded the experiment. They didn't just expose volunteers to horror content. They guided discussions about the themes and questions raised by the stories. They helped volunteers use fictional fear as a tool for confronting real anxieties. A general named entered the program specifically because his species was struggling with the concept of a potential invasion, had never experienced war, and even discussing defensive strategies caused widespread panic. Introduced to human war films, then to survival horror stories. They discussed how fictional characters prepared for danger, how they maintained hope, how they organized resistance against overwhelming threats. Within 3 months, had developed an entire defensive military doctrine for his species. The Council, which had previously been unable to discuss invasion scenarios without mass fainting episodes, approved his plans unanimously. The human stories taught us that preparing for danger doesn't make you paranoid, told. It makes you responsible. Fear isn't weakness. Refusing to acknowledge fear is weakness. 6 months into the revised experiment, the commission had data they couldn't ignore. Volunteers who completed the horror exposure program showed measurable improvements in multiple areas: crisis management, emotional regulation, philosophical resilience, and even creative problem-solving. The Galactic Council demanded a presentation. Knew this would be the moment that determined whether humanity's strange gift would be accepted or rejected by the galaxy. She spent weeks preparing her report. She compiled data, testimonials, and analysis. She brought in to help explain the human perspective. She even prepared horror content samples, carefully selected and graduated for the council's viewing. The night before the presentation, couldn't sleep, despite her species' minimal sleep requirements. She kept thinking about a quote from a human author named Stephen King. We make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones. The galaxy was about to learn whether that lesson was one they wanted to hear. Part 3. The presentation hall in the Galactic Council chambers could seat 5,000 representatives from across known space. Today, it was completely full. Word had spread about the Universal Fear Commission's findings regarding human horror entertainment, and everyone wanted to hear the results. Stood at the center podium, her four eyes scanning the assembled representatives. She could see skepticism in their body language. The delegation had their arms crossed. The group clustered together defensively. Even the typically neutral seemed uncertain. Honorable Council members, began. For 6 months, we have studied humanity's unique relationship with fear. What we have discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about psychology, resilience, and survival. She activated the display screens. The first image showed human children at a campfire, listening to an adult tell stories. Humans have been deliberately frightening themselves for thousands of years, continued. Long before they developed space travel, before they understood psychology, before they even had written language, they gathered in the darkness and told each other scary stories. They did this instinctively, without understanding why. The next screen showed brain scans comparing humans exposed to horror content versus those who avoided it. Our research has confirmed that regular, controlled exposure to fictional fear produces measurable psychological benefits. Humans who consume horror entertainment demonstrate superior crisis management, enhanced threat assessment, and remarkable emotional resilience compared to those who don't. A representative stood up. Doctor, we've seen the damage human horror content can cause. Members of your own team required therapy. How can you call this beneficial? Because we were approaching it incorrectly, replied. We treated horror content like data to be analyzed, rather than a skill to be learned. Once we brought in human consultants to teach proper exposure techniques, our results changed dramatically. She gestured to the side of the stage, where several of the experiment volunteers waited. I'd like you to hear from those who participated in our revised program. The emergency coordinator approached the podium. Her species wasn't comfortable with public speaking, but she had volunteered for this. I used to freeze during disaster drills, said her translator, rendering her clicks into standard galactic language. My fear response made me useless in emergencies. After 6 weeks of guided exposure to human horror stories, I successfully coordinated a full station evacuation. Not in simulation, real evacuation. Meteor strike. Everyone survived. She paused, gathering courage. The human stories taught me something my species never learned. Fear doesn't have to paralyze you. You can feel afraid and still act. The humans call it courage. Next came the general. His massive frame barely fit at the podium. My species had no word for defensive strategy, said. We couldn't discuss invasion scenarios without mass panic. After watching human war films and reading human survival horror, I developed comprehensive defensive protocols. The council approved them unanimously. We are no longer helpless. The humans taught us that preparing for danger is not the same as inviting it. One by one, volunteers shared their experiences. A diplomat who overcame negotiation anxiety. A scientist who learned to discuss research failures without shame. A teacher who now helped children process fears instead of suppressing them. The council listened, but could see they weren't fully convinced. They needed something more concrete. I propose a demonstration, said. With proper psychological support, I would like to show you a carefully selected piece of human horror entertainment. Not to frighten you, but to help you understand what humans see in these stories. The council debated for an hour before agreeing. Safety protocols were established. Medical teams stood ready. Counselors from multiple species positioned themselves throughout the chamber. Any representative could leave at any time. Had chosen carefully, not a film or a book, but something simpler, a human storyteller named who had helped design their experiment. Walked onto the stage, looking remarkably calm for someone about to address the entire Galactic Council. He sat down in a simple chair, no screens or special effects behind him. I'm going to tell you a story, said. It's called The Monkey's Paw. It was written by a human author over 200 years ago. It's only about 10 minutes long, and I'll pause if anyone needs me to." He began the story. A family receives a magical monkey's paw that can grant 3 wishes, but every wish comes with terrible consequences. The father wishes for money. His son dies in an industrial accident, and the compensation matches his wish exactly. Grief-stricken, the mother wishes for their son to return. They hear knocking at the door, but the son has been dead for days, and whatever is knocking isn't what it was. The father makes the final wish just before the mother opens the door. Told it simply, with no dramatic effects, just words. Several representatives left the chamber during the story, but most stayed. When he finished, silence filled the hall. Finally, an old representative stood up. "I don't understand. That story was disturbing, but I feel strange, not just frightened. There's something else." "That's the point," said gently. "The story isn't really about a monkey's paw. It's about grief, about the dangers of trying to reverse death, about accepting loss. Humans wrap these difficult concepts in scary stories because it makes them safe to examine. You just thought about death, loss, and consequences in a way you probably never have before, and you're okay." They sat down slowly, looking thoughtful. Stepped forward again. "This is what we've learned about human horror entertainment. It's not just about fear. It's a tool for exploring the darkest parts of existence in a controlled way. Humans have been practicing confronting their fears, their mortality, their worst possibilities for thousands of years. That's why they handle crises so well. They've been rehearsing." She displayed the final set of data. The Galactic Council currently faces ongoing territorial disputes in the outer reaches. Both sides are paralyzed by fear of potential conflict. Meanwhile, Earth's sector, despite having fewer resources and inferior weapons, has successfully mediated 14 territorial disputes in the last decade alone. The difference isn't technology or military strength. It's psychological preparation. "What are you proposing?" asked the Council's lead administrator. "I propose we establish a therapeutic horror program across the galaxy," said. "With human consultation and proper psychological support, we can teach other species to use horror entertainment as humans do. Not as entertainment necessarily, but as mental preparation. As a way to confront difficult truths safely." The debate that followed lasted for days. Representatives argued about safety, about cultural differences, about whether it was appropriate to deliberately frighten populations. But slowly, the council came around. The breakthrough came when a crisis erupted during the debate itself. A mining station in the outer reaches reported a catastrophic systems failure. Thousands of lives were at risk. The station's emergency coordinator was. The council watched the emergency response unfold in real time, remained calm throughout, directing evacuations, managing resources, communicating clearly. No freeze response, no panic, just competent, brave leadership. Every life on that station survived. "She learned that from human horror stories," a representative asked quietly. "She learned it from herself," replied. "The human stories just gave her permission to find her own courage." The vote wasn't even close. The council approved the establishment of the Universal Horror Therapeutic Program, with humans serving as primary consultants. Within months, training centers opened across the galaxy. A year later, published her final report on humanity's horror entertainment. She titled it Psychological Wonder: How Humanity Weaponized Fear Against Itself. The conclusion read, "Humanity has accomplished something no other known species has managed. They have turned their greatest vulnerability into their greatest strength. By deliberately exposing themselves to fictional fear, they have built psychological resilience that serves them in countless ways. They are not fearless. They are practiced at being afraid, and that practice makes them the bravest species we have encountered." The report ended with that quote from Stephen King that had struck so powerfully. "We make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones." Finally, she understood. Humans didn't seek out fear because they enjoyed suffering. They sought it out because they understood something profound. The only way to defeat fear was to face it, again and again, until it no longer had power over you. The galaxy was learning that lesson now, and it was changing everything. 5 years after its initial investigation, human horror consultants worked on over 200 worlds. Species that had never discussed mortality were now creating their own death-positive literature. Civilizations that had hidden from difficult truths were now examining them through the safety of fiction. Crisis response times had improved across the galaxy by 43%. Diplomatic negotiations that once failed due to fear of discussing worst-case scenarios now succeeded. Even exploration had expanded, as species learned to confront their fear of the unknown rather than avoiding it. Retired from the commission, but she never stopped studying human horror. She had developed, much to her surprise, a genuine appreciation for it. She even had a favorite human horror author now, a woman named Jackson who wrote about ordinary people in extraordinary situations. On her last day, a young researcher asked her what she thought was humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization. Thought about the question carefully, all four eyes focusing on something distant. Humans taught us how to be afraid, she finally said. And in doing so, they taught us how to be brave. I cannot think of a greater gift than that. Somewhere on Earth, in a darkened movie theater, a group of humans sat watching a scary film. They jumped at the scares, laughed at their own fear, and left the theater talking excitedly about what they'd just seen. They didn't know that across the galaxy, other species were learning to do the same thing. They didn't know that their strange love of being frightened had become medicine for an entire civilization. They just knew they'd had a good time being scared. And maybe thought that simple joy was the most human thing of all.